Hello! Today I'm reviewing the Beach Boys studio album 15 Big Ones from 1976, released in July. The previous studio album was Holland, released in 73, and these days it doesn't seem like that a long period, 3 years in between these albums, but at that time it was quite a long period for a rock group to have in between albums, especially for the Beach Boys, because they had been releasing albums each year, and on many years in the 60s they released multiple albums per year. So it was unusual, and the fans were very much eagerly waiting for the new release, especially, well, let's just get into it. Okay, so a little disclaimer or warning to the beginning of this video. It's gonna be a lengthy one because the album itself is lengthy. There's 15 tracks and I'm gonna go through each of them one by one. There's quite a lot of backstory with this album, and also just in general a lot of thoughts that I have concerning this album that I feel needs to be said. So, you know, anyway, let's just get into it. I'm not gonna even try to explain all of that story, that backstory, or everything that happened between Holland and this one, because there's a lot of stuff. But if you are interested in all of that, go and research it yourself, because it's super fascinating, interesting period for many reasons. But anyway, after the release of Holland, in 73, Blondie Chaplin, and in 74, Ricky Fattar both left the group, and that changed the dynamic of the live group and the group itself, because Blondie and Ricky were both members of the group. They were writing songs for them, so Car and the Passions and Holland both have songs by them. So it changed a lot, and the group really didn't know what to do when it came to their new stuff, you know, songwriting wise. They were just lost in this time period, in 74 and 75 and 76 too. Brian didn't really want to do anything with the group. He wanted to do his own stuff. People say that he was in bed for 2 or 3 years. That's not really true, but he just didn't really want to have anything to do with the Beach Boys, really. Al and Mike and Carl, that whole dynamic that they had in the early 70s, writing songs together and separately too, but coming together and finishing a great album in the style of Sunflower, Surf's Up, Car and the Passions and Holland. That whole magic was just gone after Blondie and Ricky left. They just couldn't really get it together. And it didn't really help that in 74, Endless Summer, that, you know, famous compilation album was released, which skyrocketed their popularity once again, made it clear to executives and, you know, record company people that you gotta have Brian's name on the new release if you want to, you know, be commercial, if you want to sell it, because each of those songs on Endless Summer were credited to Brian. And that was a huge obstacle for the group. And it must have been really devastating too, in a way, for especially the Wilsons, because they were really... Carl and Dennis, meaning, you know, not Brian, but Carl and Dennis, because they were really blossoming in their songwriting in that early 70s period. And the stuff that they did was amazing, but that really went nowhere. And then Endless Summer was released, and they were back at that sort of surf circus. And in between, basically, like a rock and a hard place, they really had to find a way to get Brian back into the game. And that was not an easy task. And Mike and Al didn't want to go back to that sort of more artistic period anymore, because Endless Summer was selling like crazy, and they had, you know, bills to pay, and they wanted money. So obviously they wanted to continue that path and write more fun summer hits and stuff like that. But yeah, like I mentioned, Brian didn't want to have anything to do with them. So all of those things and Jack Riley, their previous manager, left too. So all of those things together made it so that it took time for them to come up with the new studio album. In 75 they did a critically acclaimed tour with Chicago, also appearing on their new album, singing on Wishing You Were Here. Background vocals, it's a great freaking song. If you don't know that, go and check that out. It's an amazing song. And you know, they had a lot of things going on. Their live performances were huge. They were performing in Wembley, London, with Elton John, or actually like warming up Elton, I believe, and people really got their money's worth of stuff with the Beach Boys. So, you know, people just loved them. They just ate them up. And, you know, Brian wasn't there. He was at home doing his things. And, well, let's just get into the album itself. But before all of that, I have over here a newspaper article from around that time period, which is a little bit lesser known. And in this one, I'm sorry that I now don't have the date of this because it's somewhere hidden in the behind the frame. But anyway, the interviewer is interviewing Dennis Wilson, and I think there's a few, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but there is a few nice quotes that Dennis says about 15 Big Ones, because this is before the release of 15 Big Ones. And about Brian too. Having consolidated their position again, Wilson says the group intend to relax live appearances in favor of the studio in future. It may sound funny, but I want to concentrate the next 10 years on making albums. As a Beach Boy, I want to stay with them and stand behind Brian, being a tool for his disposal for the rest of my life, no matter whether it's music or mowing his lawn for him. He is a master. Musically, I am dumbfounded at him. I am in awe of him. I've grown up with him and watched him go through changes, and he is the most vulnerable human being I know. The depth of that guy. I mean, he changed the world with his influence. When you sing on something like In My Room and then sit back and listen to what he's done, not just with my part but with the song, then you realize I'm devoting my life to Brian on a musical level, and the rest of the group all feel the same way. When Brian plays something for us, we just gape. It gets very emotional. Last year, the Beach Boys opened their own studio in Los Angeles, a studio that Dennis describes as the best in the world. It is available to others for hire, but so far its only incumbents have been the group themselves, clustered around Brian Wilson, shaking down harmonies that he's written. Brian is like a little kid in the studio, like a kid who's just discovered sex for the first time. He rushes around playing this and that and telling us to play this and that. The enthusiasm he still has is infectious, really. I just think that's a really fantastic quote about that time period by Dennis. So it tells you, or me at least, that there was a lot of positivity there too. So it wasn't just all awful, negative, arguing and fighting and all of that stuff that is mostly the talk when people talk about this time period. And you know, I gotta mention this too. After Jack left, the Beach Boys hired Mike's brother Steven for their manager. And that was a huge, if you ask me, well, I wasn't there, but I believe that was a huge mistake. If you think that Mike is a villain of the story of the Beach Boys, go and read about his brothers. So in between this 3-year hiatus, the Beach Boys had fallen behind their schedule or that contract with their record company, because they were supposed to be releasing albums each year, and so they were like 3 albums behind that schedule. So the clock was ticking, and you know, they had to put something out finally. So in this early 76 they started to work on 15 Big Ones, and the original title was going to be Group Therapy, which in my opinion, as much as I actually like the title 15 Big Ones, Group Therapy sounds so much cooler, and I wish that they just held on to that instead. But there was a lot of ideas thrown around. Brian worked a lot. He wrote new songs and also was really into oldies, so he handpicked a bunch of oldies, I think about 20 tracks or so that they did in studio in early 76, and the rest of the guys didn't really deliver that much material for the sessions. it was mainly up for Brian to finish this task. And also his producing style had changed. His voice had changed a little bit, but in my opinion, not that much, because we gotta remember Brian intentionally sings a little bit differently on this album. He was very much into Randy Newman around the time, and also other sort of these growly, manly men. He always talks about how he felt that his high voice and that sort of that youthful voice he felt was too girly, and he was very insecure about that. So he wanted, when it came to the 70s, especially the later 70s and mid 70s, he wanted to find a voice, sort of this manly voice, and sing that way. And I think that sort of that culminating moment of that whole path is the Drip Drop unreleased cover song by Brian from the LA sessions. If you haven't heard that, that's a great rock and roll tune with a growly voice. It's actually a very strong vocal performance. So, you know, it was a thought out, like a purposefully done thing with Brian to sing differently when it came to the lead vocals. And he also had a laryngitis. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but, you know, laryngitis, I think that's the way you said it. So it affected his voice. People say that, oh, during these 3 years he had destroyed his voice completely with cigarettes, alcohol, and you know, cocaine, and you know. But obviously they probably did affect his voice a little bit. But in my opinion, his speaking voice remained pretty much the same. His vocals, he's mainly gone from Holland anyway. But in my opinion, the changes of his vocals were actually not that drastic, really. It was kind of, you know, smooth, slow change, really. And in my opinion, the biggest changes in his voice happened in the 80s. Because if you listen to something from, for example, I Want to Pick You Up, there's a few parts over there where Brian sings lead where he sounds exactly like his sunflower self. And if you listen to this album carefully, or Love You, Brian is singing super beautiful, high falsetto voice all over this album, and Love You too. So it's just the way his lead vocal style is just different, and the way these albums, these later 70s albums are produced is very different. It's a completely new style of producing for Brian. The sound is very dry, there's very little reverb, and things are super sort of separated, so it's not that sort of wall of sound thing. It's very different. I want to think about it as a very sort of modern way of producing and recording, really. There's very little studio gimmicks or sound effects really going on. It's very pure. I think it's something also to do with how the instruments were mic'd up, and the new studio that they had. This was mainly recorded in their own studio. So the style is just very different. There are a few tracks that sort of have that same vibe that some of their 60s stuff, but it mostly is just completely different, really. But in my opinion, the voices really hadn't changed that much, excluding Dennis, really. But it's just the way it's produced and recorded that is different. And also the intentional delivery and the performances, that sort of style. In a minute I'll be diving into the songs themselves, but just before that, quickly, I got to mention the singles that were released before and, you know, after the release of this album. The first one was Rock and Roll Music, that was released in May, and that was a huge hit for them, top 20 hit, biggest hit that they'd had for like 6-7 years, I don't know, 8, since Do It Again, I think. So yeah, that was a smash hit. And was followed up with It's Okay in the end of August. And that's a huge disaster for them, because they should have followed up that single with It's Okay. Actually, I preferred if they just flipped them, because It's Okay is a freaking masterpiece. It should have been bigger hit. It should have been a #1 hit, and it could have been if it was released actually in the summertime. That's the problem with it. But even because of that, even after that mistake, it's still charted, I believe, in top 20, so it was a hit anyway. But that was a huge missed opportunity. And the third single, Everyone's in Love with You, shouldn't have been released at all, and it didn't chart, but it was released later anyway. So yeah, let's just get into the tracks. Oh, before that, I gotta mention the artwork, obviously. I love the album artwork. A lot of people hate it. It's it's funny. It introduces the classic Dean Torrance logo. I love the logo. Don't like the new logo that they just upgraded a few years back at all. This is a great one. This is a classic one, not the new one. It has the Olympic rings, 15 big ones thing over here is great too. It sort of has a sort of jukebox theme, which I think suits the theme of the album or the sort of the music too. So it's great. Back cover is amazing. It has liner notes showing or telling who plays on what. I don't know how accurate they are, but I love that they actually included this information over here because it showcases that the Beach Boys are actually playing. Brian is playing like most of the instruments on the album, just like with Love You too. But he's all over it, and I love that. But there's also some of the Wrecking Crew members, and you know, a lot of session musicians too, but they are mostly sort of just featuring artists. They are not really carrying this record the way the Beach Boys are. I love that, and I also really love the inner gatefold. It's got a cool montage of or collage of photographs from throughout the years. From the early days, you got Glenn Campbell, you got Audrey Murray, you got like some of the villains of the story too. Like cool pictures of Brian and the rest of the guys, Carl looking super, and whole group looking super cool over here. And then there's a picture of Mike's passport, Banana and Louis over there. There's just a lot of cool details over here, so I love it. And it didn't have any like sort of special inner sleeve. So, anyway, okay. Love the artwork. The only thing that's sort of weird is Al looking that way. He's kind of like, screw you guys. I'm looking this way. I'm not even looking at the camera. I can imagine him being super grumpy in the photo shoot. He's like, I'm not gonna look in the camera. I'm just gonna look to the right over here. Take your picture. I'm getting the hell out of here. I don't know. It's weird. Anyway. Okay, the songs. So the album starts off with Rock and Roll Music, and this song is such a controversial one. It seems that most people hate it. I don't personally know why, because I've always loved it. I think it's a great song, and dare I say it's my favorite version of the song. And wait a second before you throw rocks at me and shout boo. First of all, okay, so. And this applies actually to all of the oldies over here, because I didn't grow up in the 50s or 60s, or even 70s. I'm born in the 90s. I didn't actually know pretty much any of these old songs before listening to this album, so this was my introduction to these songs mostly. I think I had heard Rock and Roll Music, probably both versions, the Beatles and the Chuck Berry one before, but I never really liked that song that much. It was just a sort of simple rock tune, early rock tune, and that was it. Sort of just sounds kind of like anything Chuck Berry did, which is great. I really like Chuck Berry, but all of his songs, mostly, at least the hits, they kind of just are the same song with different lyrics. And the Beatles did a cool cover of it, but they just did it the same way, really. They just played Rock and Roll Music as Chuck Berry wrote it, the way Beatles would have done it. In that, like, there's really nothing added to it. There's really nothing, I don't know, special about it. It's a simple song. It's performed well by Chuck Berry and the Beatles, but that song never blew my mind or really, I don't know, affected me in any way, really. So I don't know if I even remember those versions before, when I was listening to this album the first time. And the rest of these oldies, I didn't know them at all. Obviously, now that I've got to know the songs, I have gone back and listened to the originals as well. But yeah, okay, so that I just had to say. Rock and Roll Music, I love that. It's my favorite version of the song. Probably my favorite mix of the Beach Boys version is the Made in California version with that added verse, and it also has more audible Brian Wilson falsetto parts. They are audible in the album version too, but they are lifted up in the mix in that Made in California version, so check that out. The single version has much more prominent synth bass, and it's got its merits too, but I prefer this one. Some people say that, a lot of people say the main criticism for this track, well, two things. Mike loves lead vocals, and then that it's just limp and slow and whatever, too soft. But I disagree on both of those. I can kind of understand the criticism on Mike's lead vocals, because they are very nasal, but I still like them. I think they are powerful. I wish that he had sung it a little bit more like in the way that he sung on the Carnegie Hall concert, for example, Jumping Jack Flash or All I Want to Do, that more edgier style. Sure, I wish that he'd done something more like that, because he really was able to do that. So I don't really know why he chose, I don't know, maybe it was Brian's idea, because this track definitely borrows a lot from Surfing USA. Basically, the whole idea behind, doing this song is the same, is to sort of look back and sort of reminiscent Surfing USA, because that borrows from Chuck Berry's other tune. And this is sort of, it has similar things, like the start-stop rhythm, for example, and obviously Mike's lead vocals and other stuff too, but it does borrow some parts or some stylistic elements from Surfing USA. So there's that factor. But I think, truthfully, that if Dennis or Al or Carl would have sung the lead on this same version, the same backing track, everything, I think 50% of the people that don't like this version would actually realize how genius it is, because it truly actually does have some genius things in it. Let me explain. The arrangement, for example, it is super interesting. The original one is a simple rock tune, but Brian did something. This is very well thought out. He adds parts in it that are not in the original. Every drum beat and guitar lick and the saxophone and the synth which is a super cool and weird adding, really, to this song. They all are super unique, very well thought out. And the background vocals, and not to even mention them, all the background vocals are added, new stuff that Brian composed basically for this tune. And I don't know, I just love the whole song. I never skip it, and I don't know, I love it. I completely love it. My favorite things are probably Dennis is drumming, and he drums on a lot of songs actually on this album. Very powerful drumming. But then the guitar parts, those guitar licks, they are so fantastic. And that synth bass, in my opinion, if you think that this song doesn't rock hard enough, you are playing it way too low. You have to pump up your volume a lot. You can hear a lot of cool things hidden in the mix if you listen to it loud enough. So, embrace it and pump up the volume. I think you're gonna hear new things in it and appreciate it differently. But anyway, everybody's got their opinion, so if you hate it, you are free to hate it. But I always loved it. Anyway, It's Okay follows then Rock and Roll Music, and It's Okay is one of the better original tracks, might be even the best original one on the album. It's a classic Beach Boys tune. Everything about it, in my opinion, is fantastic. It's got that magical Brian Wilson tag and that length to structure. Some people like to compare it to Do It Again, but I don't really see much similarities with these two. Do It Again is structurally completely different. Even the theme is different. It's Okay is happening now. Do It Again is about nostalgia. It's Okay has completely different production style. Really everything. The only similarity really is the songwriter and the lead singer and the group. But anyway, It's Okay. Great lyrics, great lead vocal performance by Mike, amazing background vocals, my favorites being Dennis Wilson's bass vocals and the tag part. Oh, it is so cool. I think the synth bass on this one, the bass line is one of the coolest things ever. And this song is a rock song, but it is so kind of strange in a Brian Wilson way that it doesn't really feature prominently guitar. It actually features much more saxophone. So the whole arrangement is super weird, really. And I love the way Mike's group has been playing this song in the 2000s, adding that guitar riff, which kind of is there in the composition, but it's just not played as a guitar riff in the recording. So anyway, just a cool tune, always loved it, and Dennis really nails it. And I love that Dennis is singing prominently on this whole album, whether it's lead vocals or background vocals. I think this is sort of the peak Dennis Wilson over here that we get, and I love it, and it truly just makes a difference. Third song is another original one, Hatophonia. This one is super awesome. Could have been on Friends, really, and I love it how each member gets their own little lead vocal section, lead line, and the tag part with Brian, Mike, and it's quirky. The arrangement once again, and that whole those instruments and those parts that they play, it's very unique. It is not a rock song, it's not really a pop song, it's one of those day in the life of Brian Wilson kind of tracks, but very unique. I think the whole arrangement and the production is one of Brian's really highest qualities. So I don't know, if you don't agree, check out the instrumental version from the Made in California box set. It is amazing. The fourth song is the second cover song, and it is Chapel of Love. And I don't really have much to say about this. This is the first prominent Brian Wilson lead vocal on the album. I really like it. I think it's charming, and it does well what it's supposed to do. It's a fun song, kind of has this wedding vibe, but there's really nothing much to it other, it's an alright, the original is an alright tune, and this one is a pretty good tune too. And I love Brian's production on this one again, because he's playing with synthesizer, but basically this sort of string heaven blissful thing. It's just super weird. He's using synthesizer really uniquely on this track, and some other tracks too, but this is sort of the first one of the bunch. And then that is followed with Everyone's in Love with You, which is Mike's second solo composition on a Beach Boys album. And this song I used to like a lot, but I don't know, I'm very lukewarm about it these days. I can listen to it, but in my opinion, Charles Lloyd, he's a great, saxophonist and flute player, and all of that, great musician. But I in my opinion, his parts destroy the track. It goes way too cheesy, and it sounds like something drunk Bruce Johnston would produce. It's just not very good. The composition itself is alright, and the melody is pretty good. I don't really like the lyrics, and the arrangement and that production on this track is just, in my opinion, it doesn't fit the album, and I think it's one of the weakest offerings of the whole really bunch of songs. Then that is followed with Talk to Me, which is once again a cover tune, and in between, at the very end, there's a part of Tallahassee Lassie too. This is an alright cover. I don't really mind the Talk to Me song. I think the whole, and the way Brian is or produced this thing, arranged it, I think the tempo is way too low, because I'm not that familiar, by the way, with the original. I have heard it, but I cannot now remember how much it differs from this one. But just that melody is so boring to me. That talk to me, talk to me. It's like, oh, come on, next song, please. I don't really like that. I can listen to it, but it's one of my least favorite covers on the album. And that's sort of, the whole mid-section of this album is problematic, and that's a shame really, because it starts off really strong and it ends off really strong. That same song is the second to last track on side A. That's a great song, Brian Wilson original. Once again, he wrote the lyrics too, and it describes sort of the story of music, And the only problem with this version is that we have the TV special version with the Rock Baptist church choir, this gospel choir that they did live for that TV special. And that version blows this one out of the water. The production on this one is very weird. It's kind of interesting, but this song should be this bombastic, cool gospel rock song, but the version that we get over here is, I don't know, it sounds like a novelty tune, which it kind of is, but the treatment just doesn't really make justice for it, because the melody, that composition is actually excellent. And I also really like Brian's vocals on it, so it's a shame that we didn't get on the album itself anything that would reminiscent or remind of that great live version with just the piano, the group, and the choir, because that's awesome. And TM song is not really a song. I would love to know the sort of the reasons behind this track, because it's just a little jam with this spoken word argument part in the beginning, and it's my least favorite tune on the whole album. I don't really like it. I just really don't. I do like at the very end there's this that groovy part right before it ends. You know, that where Brian counts it in 1, 2, 3, and then you get the transcendental meditation. That's a cool part. But I can really imagine this song being something that Brian was forced to write, because I don't believe he was doing TM at this time period. So it could have been something Al or Mike sort of forced him to do. It just doesn't really sound like anything that Brian would have had his full heart, on it. But then we get into side B, and side B starts off extremely strongly with Palisades Park. The original is by Freddie Cannon, and I prefer this version so much because the original one is faster, it's more traditional, it has this sort of 50s rock and roll style, and it is a good song too, good version. The original one, I'm not saying that it's bad, but I like what Brian did over here because he slowed the tempo down a little bit, which added this sort of melancholiness into the song, because it has that sort of nostalgic, or that creates a sort of nostalgic looking back to something that was something beautiful, or something that you are sort of hearkening back to. At least in my opinion, it sort of changes very simple song that's sort of just a joyful song to something kind of bittersweet. And Carl's lead vocals really deliver that message all the way through home. Such a soulful lead vocal. I just talked about this in a recent video, that this is actually one of my favorite Carl Wilson lead vocals. And I love that part that you have in the beginning and at the end, which Brian once again just completely composed. That run, 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 rise a running part, which might have been borrowed from some other tune, I don't know. But still, it was added to this song, it's not on the original, and in my opinion that makes the whole tune. It has a cool organ solo too. And the Beach Boys had done a few sort of these amusement park songs previously too, and I don't like either of those at all. So it's kind of nice for a change to have a amusement park song on a Beach Boys album that I truly love. And this is probably one of my most played Beach Boys songs, to be honest. And then that is followed with a Sunflower outtake by Al Jardine's Tuesday Cincinnati. And this track, once again, I think it's one of the weakest offerings of this album. I don't really have much to say about it. I used to like it a lot more, but these days it's usually something that I skip if I listen to it streaming. The song sounds like it's about a prostitute, but apparently it's about a taxi driver. I don't know, it's kind of strange song. I do like Dennis's background vocals on it, and there's that cool sort of instrumental part at the middle where Al is sort of just shouting, and that's a very cool part, and that guitar riff, I guess, cool too. But I don't think it fits this album because it has a very different production style, and I don't think it's that strong of a composition really. So, I know this song has a lot of fans, and I like it too. I'm not saying it's a bad tune, but I just don't think it really fits the album. That's then followed with A Casual Look, which has a Mike Love lead vocal. Once again, Mike doesn't have that many lead vocals on here. Casual Look, for me, it falls somewhere in the middle section of the covers. I like it, but it isn't nowhere near as good as the rest of the covers on side B. But it's alright. I really like it. Not really, I don't really have anything else to say about that. And then that's followed with Blueberry Hill, which in my opinion is one of the best covers on the album. Great arrangement. Brian once again just delivers. He basically composes new sections, completely new parts to this song. The original one, that I don't think it's the original one, but the most well-known version of this song is by Fats Domino, and obviously that's a classic tune. So I don't think there's any point in comparing this to that. They are completely different style anyway. So the Beach Boys version is so much different, and to me at least, just this version is very heartbreaking. I think Mike's vocals are amazing, and I like the way that this song especially is super dry. And by the way, it has the classic Wrecking Crew backup band playing, so that's super cool too. But I love how you can just really clearly hear the vocals and each instrument and the percussion. Everything just sounds so crisp, clear, dry, and I love that, because for once you can sort of easily hear those things that Brian made up, because with a lot of those 60s things he sort of drowned a lot of it in this reverb, sort of in a way that Phil Spector would do also. So it's very hard to digest or separate what you're hearing. So I really actually enjoy the style that he decided to use on this album. And Love You too. Love You follows very similar style. Back Home is then the last original one on the whole album, and it originates in the early 60s. The band did this multiple times throughout the years. This one, the one that got released finally, is a new recording, and it's my favorite. I love Brian's super fun, like he is so into the song. I love his vocals. And I love the bass, it's just so groovy. Love the drums, love Brian's, Brian really gets into the song. It's impossible to listen to this song and this performance without getting joyful yourself too. And I love the lyrics too, because that's one of those songs that I can really, I've never fed the chickens back home or whatever, I haven't had horses, but I can really understand that sort of landscape. So I don't know, it feels very personal song to me anyway. And I love Brian's lead vocals on it. It truly makes the song for me. Second to last song on the album is In the Still of the Night. That's a great classic tune from the 50s. And Dennis is doing an amazing performance over here. There's really not much to say about it. It's so soulful. Always loved it, always will, and very heartbreaking tune, great performance, great production. It kind of follows very closely the original, so Brian didn't add too much for this one. It's pretty basic rendition. But then the last song on the album is nothing like that, it's the complete opposite. Just Once in My Life, which is a song that originally Righteous Brothers did, and the original one is amazing. Don't get me wrong, so that's amazing, but I'm gonna talk about this separately over here. Brian did something so unique with this one. He did this synth, sort of this synth pop version of, of this classic song, and he changed, because the original one has, okay, I'm gonna talk about that a little bit. The original one has very powerful lead vocals, but this one has a very different approach when it comes to the lead. Carl and Brian share it, but they use dynamics so much more. It's not just singing with full power, all the way through. They go very sort of almost to whisper at some points. And then when you get those percussions and those drums, those heavy drums, and it explodes and the feeling just builds up, and Carl's lead vocals, they just explode. It's a really amazing performance, one of Carl's best. But in my opinion, Brian might even be doing greater performance on this one because his vocals on it are so soulful when he does that baby part. It's just it's an amazing way to end the record. Classic rendition, and like I mentioned in the beginning, this album starts off very strongly and it ends off very strongly, and because of that, to me, this album has always been very strong, like in my mind. But when I actually sat down and thought about it critically, I do realize that the middle section is kind of wonky. But the thing with this album is it's got 15 tracks and it's almost 40 minutes long, so it's one of the longest Beach Boys albums. So in my opinion, if you think about it, think about how much great stuff it offers for you, worth of your money, really. Even if I take out the tracks that I find the weakest, which are the offerings by Mike and Al, and then one or two of those covers, really, TM Song and Talk to Me, you'd still have an album that is longer than 30 minutes. So, you'd got like 11 tracks still, 10 or 11 tracks. So, in my opinion, where this album really suffers, or the reason why this suffers, is the democratic way of compiling. It's not the material itself, it's just the cohesiveness, really, of the finished product, because the original idea was to just do oldies, covers, and then do an album filled with originals. And I think it actually would have worked really well if you'd have a double LP, first album being covers and the second album being originals. Because there's a lot of outtakes too out there from these sessions that are amazing and blow a few of these tracks out of the water that actually ended up on the album. So, in my opinion, it's a strong period for them creatively. I think the material is strong, and I think it's overlooked. And I find it very interesting that oftentimes Brian is described being very miserable in these sessions and this time period. But when asked from Brian himself, he states that this was his favorite period, and that 15 Big Ones and Love You are his favorite albums. So, obviously Brian's been known to have many many answers to the same questions, and people have different favorites when it comes to different parts of your life, so it's understandable. But I think it's clear that Brian did enjoy at least partly the creation of it, and his heart was there when he was doing the songs that he wanted to do and the originals too. So I think this deserves another look, and I don't think it deserves the hate that it gets. And a lot of people do love You, and they still hate this one, and I feel that's kind of strange, because in my opinion these are perfect companion pieces to one another. This is very similar to Love You. The only main difference when it comes to the production and the performances really is that this one uses more session musicians and real instruments, organic instruments. But the style, the songwriting, the stuff that Brian wrote for this one could have been just as well in the album Love You, really. And okay, so anyway, I think that's really it. What do you think about 15 Big Ones? It was a long video, rambly video, but I really love the album. I would love to know your opinions on it. See you in the comment section. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye bye.